Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Rates of cancer among young people have been increasing in recent years. And this fact is ever more sobering as we approach World Cancer Day, which is February 4th. Joining us now to talk about these rising rates of cancer, what might be causing it, but also innovations in treatment, is Helmy Eltoukhy. He is the co-founder, co-CEO, and chairman of Guardant Health, and he has a lot of insight to share with us. Helmy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the question that I've been asking just about everyone in healthcare and science over the last year or so, as we've seen some of these statistics. What is driving these increasing rates of cancer among young people?
I don't think there's a clear answer to that. I mean, the statistics are pretty staggering, though. We're seeing that there's a 1 to 2% rise annually in those under 50. I think there's a prediction that over the next 10 years, there'll be a 30% jump in terms of early onset cancers. We're seeing things like colorectal cancer increase rapidly in terms of diagnoses under the age of 40. Obviously, there have been some very famous sort of movie stars and so on that have succumbed to the disease in recent years. There's a few hypotheses in terms of diet, lack of exercise, carcinogens in our food and the air and water, but I don't think a clear smoking gun quite yet.
I've talked to some folks who say that part of these rising rates could be from just increased diagnosing, earlier diagnosing, more screenings, more testing. And so while there might be more cases, those cases could be stage 1 or stage 0. In your experience, in your role, does that hold water?
I think that could be part of it, but the rise seems to be slightly, higher, especially when you think about like fatal cancers or later stage cancers. That I think by itself seems to be rising as well. So it seems to be more than just this sort of lead time bias that comes with better early detection.
So Guardant Health is a biotech company. Why can you draw the connection between why it is we're talking for World Cancer Day? How is Guardant getting involved?
Yeah, so this is really why we founded the company was the fact that we just saw that cancer out of many of the other diseases there was one where we continue to be blindsided by the onset of it, by the diagnosis of it, the fact that I have friends these days that are getting diagnosed with late stage lung cancer, stage 4 lung cancer, even today. And they seem otherwise healthy. They seem, they're exercising, they're eating well. And so it just seemed crazy that in this day and age that we didn't have a way of detecting cancer much earlier and really having a sort of navigation system in terms of what best next step to take against the disease to fight it and hopefully cure it. And so we started the company really to tackle the entire cancer care continuum. Our first test we launched was a blood test for existing cancer patients, essentially to match them with better therapies without needing a tissue biopsy. And that test today is used in nearly 30% of all US cancer patients now, which is really exciting to see that become a new standard of care. And then going all the way to the other end of the spectrum, early detection of cancer. We got the first FDA-approved blood test that is covered by Medicare for the early detection of colorectal cancer, and that got launched and approved in August of 2024.
Of course, as a business reporter, I hear blood testing and my spidey sense kind of goes up. Can you talk about the approval process and your experience as a founder in this space in the post-Theranos environment? Did you do extra clinical trials? Have you taken extra measures to prove the efficacy of your blood diagnostics?
Yeah, I mean it's night and day. I mean, yeah, I think you look at some of those other companies. They didn't go through a peer-reviewed publication. They didn't do large studies. They really didn't get FDA approval in terms of what they were claiming. For instance, our Shield test is FDA approved on the basis of a 20,000 plus patient study, one of the largest diagnostic studies done in the U.S. These are patients that are all getting colonoscopies, and then we're comparing the results of the blood test, where the results were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which has the highest impact factor of any journal in medicine. It's the gold standard. And that's just, for that test. We have now over 500 peer-reviewed publications on our technology. It's rock solid. There's literally been thousands and thousands of patients that have been involved in studies with the technology.
So, can we go through a sample use case? You mentioned colorectal cancer. They might get a biopsy, but then Guardant might provide a blood test that I guess allows the physician to better tailor the treatment plan.
Yeah, so our first test for the late stage patients is used in all solid tumors. I think the best example is a lung cancer patient. So let's say you have a stage 3, stage 4 lung cancer patient. These tests are called liquid biopsies. This test specifically is called Guardant 360. Instead of doing a biopsy, which in lung cancer on average costs about $14,000, has a 19% complication rate, and unfortunately a 1 to 2% mortality rate, a physician could essentially draw a tube of blood. And then based on that, we can actually genetically sort of profile the tumor itself, find the sort of mutations and the alterations there that drive that cancer uniquely, and then recommend one of the best available therapies to sort of target that cancer in a very sort of rifle shot approach. And so that has kind of really changed the way that lung cancer and many other cancers are managed and treated.
Oh, that's really interesting. How well do you think patients know about this as an option? And are you trying to change the standard of care by going through the the journals and the physician side, or in talking to organizations like Forbes, are you trying to bring some patient awareness to this option?
I think we're in different segments of that journey. That's a great question. So I think for tests like Garden 360, which we launched 10 years ago, that is already an NCCN guidelines in terms of using that on cancer patients, using it up front, using it to essentially test patients every time their cancer changes. The cancer mutates just like COVID does in some ways. That's why patients relapse and unfortunately succumb to the disease. And so having a blood test that can essentially be there every step of the way, sort of tracking the disease and helping the physician adaptively manage therapies. That is really something that is, part of the standard of care today. Where I think we're trying to bring more awareness are the newer tests like Shield, which is really the first blood test for early detection of cancer that's both FDA approved and covered by Medicare. And so this is something that essentially anyone 65 and over now has potentially access to with either $0 copay or very little out-of-pocket costs. And it's something that, has high performance, can be used if, they don't want to do a colonoscopy, can be used, instead of a, stool test, which can be unpleasant. And, I think the big issue with colorectal cancer is the fact that it's highly preventable. We have about 50,000 people in the US that die every year of the disease. And it's, largely because there are about 50 million Americans that are not screened today, out of the 120 million or so that should be screened. And those 50 million are sort of responsible for about 76% of the deaths that happen on an annual basis. And so we know early detection works in colorectal cancer. It's just unfortunately colonoscopies and stool tests are sort of unpleasant options. They're not accessible for many individuals who can't take 2 days off of work to go and do the prep and have someone drive them to the procedure. And so, being able to have a sort of a very simple, pleasant blood test that is essentially a seamless part of someone's annual physical, I think is going to make a big difference in terms of bending mortality curves for colorectal cancer.
The accessibility is a really good point. I have read guides from people who've gone through the colonoscopy process, talking about the ideal time of day to start the prep. And these are folks who can afford to work from home, which, of course, is not 100% of the US population by a long shot. So that is an enviable and admirable goal. I'm sure you have competitors who are trying to do the same. How would you categorize the rate of change in this area? Because I think if you're a patient going through this, you might not be paying attention to all the latest news out of the scientific journal. Where are we in terms of, let's just talk about diagnostics, right now in 2025 compared to when you started the company?
Yeah, no, it's been really staggering in terms of like the improvement in the technology. So when you think about traditional diagnostic tests, they're sort of one-off tests. You kind of do one test for vitamin D, another test for your CBCs, another test for your lipids, and so on. And you're actually generating very little data per test. The tests we have today, we're generating gigabytes and gigabytes of information. We're looking broadly across one's genome, looking at all the bases there, looking at different switches on those on those genes as well. And so we're getting, I guess, yeah, we're getting an enormous amount of medical data, clinical data out of each individual. And so this is really a new era of diagnostic testing. I call it really like kind of the computer age of diagnostic testing. We call some of our tests smart liquid biopsies, just like your smartphone sort of took our mobile devices from simple cell phone communications to full-fledged computers that could do so many things and essentially run our lives. And I think that's what we're starting to see now. This colorectal early detection test we have today that's FDA approved, in the future, we'll just turn software on and be able to detect, a dozen other cancers as well. We already have, great data on detecting, for instance, pancreatic cancer and gastric cancer and lung cancer and so on from the same test. We're actually selected um, by the NIH for a multi-cancer early detection study called the Vanguard study. It's a 25,000 patient study that we'll be starting this year with the same test. And then with the same test, we're also able to see signals from cardiovascular disease, liver disease, inflammatory diseases. And so, it's really exciting to think about an era where a blood test that is looking broadly against, essentially everything that's in your blood, or at least a large segment of it, combined with AI, combined with essentially being able to sort of label those signals we're seeing, could eventually be, essentially a primary care physician's best friend, essentially a co-pilot to every primary care physician.
That almost sounds like science fiction. I go in for my physical, I get a blood draw, and just the panel can tell you, or does it require longitudinal blood draws? So not just in 2025, but do you only draw the conclusions in 26, 27, 28 after a few years of consistent testing?
No, a lot of it could be done with a single blood draw. But then to your point, we don't use longitudinal data in medicine very well. I mean, something like baseline temperature is not even well recorded for individuals. We're told a fairy tale that it's 98.6 for everyone, but it can be anywhere from 97 to 99 degrees. And so imagine having sort of baseline signals across gigabytes of information that is, coming from you on an annual or semi-annual basis. And so not only will the first test do so much more than current tests can today, but essentially having subsequent tests will allow us to get to even finer and finer resolution and have that sort of early warning signal that we all dreamed about that medicine should provide.
You mentioned AI as part of that diagnostic suite of tools, and I'm wondering on the treatment side, are there AI developments that you can speak to, or just in general developments that patients should be aware of? Because I do think, just to pull back, when you hear the statistics about the increased number of people who have been diagnosed, it sounds very dire. But if the treatments are progressing at a faster rate than people are being diagnosed, perhaps that offers some hope.
Oh yeah, for sure. So I think there's sort of two essentially avenues towards fighting some of these increasing rates of cancers. First is just detecting these diseases much earlier. We know earlier detection, even without better treatments, leads to better outcomes. We can cut it out while it's still curable. We know that the current treatments work much better the earlier you find the disease. So that's really the first sort of prong in terms of the war on cancer. The second is, certainly better next generation therapies. And we work now with over 180 pharma companies on their clinical trials. They use our technology to find patients that may match their therapies much easier than doing biopsies and so on, just using blood tests that are out there. And we're also able to take essentially patients that have failed in some of those trials, see why they failed, because we can see how the cancer has mutated sort of post relapse, and then come in and help them design even better therapies that can essentially not, be less sort of less weak in terms of the cancer evading those drugs. And so it's really exciting. We're seeing essentially vast progress on both sides, the detection side as well as the treatment side, because of our ability to now put a lens and shine a lens on cancer at a much more fundamental level.
So, as we approach World Cancer Day, do you have an overarching message to people watching, or especially people who are currently being treated for cancer?
Yes, I would say that the future is extremely bright. The first step in the war of cancer is just being able to know your enemy. We're almost there now with these new blood tests that can detect cancer much earlier and much simpler, much more simply. And then two, I think the types of treatments that have now come into the picture are really exciting. We're seeing lung cancer patients, metastatic lung cancer patients that 10 years ago had a life expectancy of 6 months now have progression-free survivals, essentially disease-free survival for over 5 years now with some of the new therapies that are out there. So I have no doubt in 10 years we'll see a significant decrease in mortality in many deadly cancers.
I have to ask because you are referring to progress, but on the federal side, we've seen some executive actions from the new administration that could affect NIH and NCI labs and research and clinical trials. Are you worried at all about continuing your research and trials in this new environment?
For us, most of the trials are outside of sort of government funding. They're funded by pharma companies or funded by other organizations. We also have very broad reach. Our technology and our testing is available in about 60 countries. We have deep relationships in Europe and Asia, Japan, in terms of, some of the top researchers. And so, we're fortunately pretty well diversified. And I'm hopeful, though. I mean, America is really built on sort of innovation, progress, and I'm hopeful that that sort of trend line will continue despite kind of some back and forth in terms of the government spending, government funding side of things.
And then I have to ask, and this sounds like a cynical consumer, but sometimes I know that scientists like to hold their discoveries for
Yeah.
themselves, but you just referenced collaboration globally. So are you finding, broadly speaking, in your conversations, that no matter where you go, people are other scientists, other co-founders and CEOs are open about sharing data, sharing innovations in order to get the best treatments to the world?
Yeah, we find when we work with clinicians, most of them are really heroes in the front lines. I mean, they went into medicine to really help patients, and of course, like there's competition between companies and even between clinicians. But at the end of the day, it really is competition that helps us sort of strive for being better in some ways. And so you just have to know, I would say, how to work with people, find the win-win. And end of the day, I think our utmost value at Guardant, which is putting patients first, sort of carries our ability to work with all of these physicians in these different groups because they're in it for the same reason. They want to put patients first as well. As long as we keep that as a common goal, we usually get to a pretty good outcome in terms of the collaborations that we forge.
Well, Helmy, we started with a depressing statistic, but I am feeling more hopeful. So, as we head into World Cancer Day, thank you so much for coming on and talking about the state of not just diagnostics, but also treatment. We really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Maggie. I appreciate your time as well.